Hello and welcome everybody in the room and everybody on Zoom. I am delighted to be introducing Stephen Hinshaw, who is going to inaugurate our grand rounds for this year today. And I've been told that I have 1 minute and Steve's CV is very big. So what I am going to do is just read a brief summary and make a couple of comments. So as we know, Steve is a distinguished professor of psychology at UC Berkeley and a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at UCSF, where he also until recently served as vice chair for psychology. His research has focused on ADHD, self-harm, clinical interventions, and importantly, stigma reduction. He has authored over 410 articles and chapters plus 12 books, and his memoir, Another Kind of Madness, was best book in memoir autobiography from the American Book Fest in 2018, and is truly an amazing book. Among national, international awards, he's gotten the James McKim Cattell Fellow Award from the Association for Psychological Sciences in 2016, the Distinguished Scientific Contributions to Child Developmental Award, Society for Research in Child Development 2017. He had the Ruan Prize for Outstanding Achievement in Child and Adolescent Psychiatric Research 2019, Distinguished Scientific Contributions Award from the APA, American Psychological Association 2020, the Samat International Prize in Mental Health from the National Academy of Medicine in 2020, and was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2021. His work is covered extensively and is also received extensive media coverage, included in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CBC Evening News, Today Show, and more. And I will say that when I joined UCSF, I was well aware of his work, which definitely is well known outside of the bounds of UCSF. And I am very excited for us that you're going to be talking about a disorder that is highly under-recognized and highly stigmatized, including in the many adults who walk around without knowing that they have it. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Anne. Hello, everyone here and on Zoom. One announcement before we get started. By complete serendipity, UCSF is opening next month its 2.0 version of a major disability awareness campaign. I was a participant in 1.0 of the Faces of Ability a couple of years ago during the pandemic. And so because of this, our photographer at UCSF, Susan Merrill, is here to take some pictures. She's in the back. And if you would like, if you don't have to rush anywhere right after and we want to chat a little bit afterwards, it'd be nice to get some photos, not just of me, but you'll probably have to sign a consent form. Second, you will hear today of a lot of work our team at Berkeley has done, and two of the massive contributors to that work are our own Christine Zalecki and Liz Owens, and I see Liz here. I'm not sure if Christine is, and you'll see their names in author lists, but we couldn't have done anything without their work, and they're now full-time here. So let's get started. Funding from NIH, NIDA, NIMH, Charles Schwab Foundation right now, and royalties from a number of publishers. So first, I'm going to start with a top 10 list as to why girls and women with ADHD have been neglected since the history of ADHD, before it was even called ADHD. We'll talk a little bit about how certain developmental psychopathology principles might help rectify this situation. I'll talk about sex differences a little, but much more about female trajectories in a big longitudinal study we've been doing for many years at Berkeley. Cover a slight bit about any evidence for differences in treatment response between males and females with ADHD, and then conclude with a few words on stigma and why, seeming paradox, why would ADHD receive stigma? I thought that occurred for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and psychotic disorders, but maybe not so surprisingly, once we listen in, ADHD, particularly in girls and women, receives a lot of stigma. And then I'll have a couple of concluding slides. So ADHD, like everything else we study in our fields of clinical psychology and psychiatry, is not a category per se, but it's extreme of a dimension. I learned in grad school that you either had or had not autism or bipolar disorder. And now, of course, we talk about autism spectrum disorders and bipolar spectrum disorders. And ADHD clearly is a spectrum condition itself. In attention disorganization, comprising one of the key dimensions, and hyperactivity, impulsivity, the other. Notice hyperactivity, impulsivity ought to be termed hyperverbality and or hyperactivity, and impulsivity if we're going to catch appropriate females for diagnosis. Heritability of ADHD is enormously high, 0.75 to 0.8, but we can't make the mistake that too many people in the field do to say it's really heritable. All we can do is gene replacement therapy, which of course doesn't work for polygenic disorders, or give medications or biological treatments. Both of those are simply untrue. So I'm going to kick off with a little bit of fun and controversy through the doctrine of fair use. I don't work for pharma or consult, but I could show, as I will in a moment, a few ads for ADHD medications over the last couple of decades to make a couple of points. So here's an ad for Concerta from 22 years ago, a year after it received its patent and trademark. Concerta is essentially long-acting methylphenidate, generic trade name Ritalin. And through space age at the time, little laser plastic contraption in your stomach, it squirts out the Ritalin over 10 to 12 hours rather than the usual half-life of 3 to 4. It was the first really successful long-term stimulant. So here we see in this ad, the stereotype at the time, ADHD was a white middle-class male phenomenon. So the smiling mother and the smiling boy, and mom is saying, when we give him his Concerta, we see Jason, not his ADHD. Whether it's true that seeing your kid medicated reveals the real kid and takes away the stigma is a very powerful message. So in my kind of informal annals of ADHD medication ads, this is the first one that really indirectly said, medicating your kid removes the stigma, seeing the real person, not these bothersome, annoying symptoms. Now, a couple years later, this is an ad for what was then very small, but now is clearly the largest growing market for ADHD meds, which is adults. And this is for Adderall XR, extended release, a beaded formulation to squirt out mixed amphetamine salts over a day rather than a few hours. And if you've got really good eyes, you can actually see citations of the psychiatric literature. And the clear suggestion is that if you take your ADHD meds, you're likely to stay married, because if you don't, you're twice as likely to get divorced as anybody else. And you're a third more at risk for major depression. So you better take the meds. Again, very powerful messages, whether those simplistic linear causal pathways are true or not. And here's a third ad from this past decade, which was sponsored by CHAD, a major self-help organization, and ADA, and a couple of pharma firms, about Shane Victorino, the first Hawaiian American to play Major League Baseball. Shane was a big, powerful guy, won a World Series ring with the Phillies and with the Red Sox, top 10 home run hitter. And this campaign was to destigmatize ADHD, because a big, strong Shane Victorino can disclose his ADHD and take ADHD meds. Well, why can't anybody? But there's another reason why Shane says, on this large slide, got cut off the text a little bit, I didn't outgrow my ADHD. That's why I'm telling my story. Well, there's another reason why Shane told his story. Because if he took ADHD meds without an exemption and a medical diagnosis, he'd be thrown out for 81 games, half a season. Because for anybody taking stimulants, your reaction time gets a little better by a couple tenths of a second. And maybe that, this is the controversy. Are some adults, especially in a sport like baseball, prone to get a diagnosis to give them a performance edge? And in fact, the last time I checked, twice as many Major League Baseball players had ADHD exemptions as did NFL or NHL or NBA players, which could be a fascinating epidemiological study, Or it could be there's a simpler explanation. Baseball's the most boring sport that was ever created by humans. Until they sped up the game this past season, 4-hour games. And in the 10th inning, that sinking line drive, you've got to catch, or that hanging curveball. Maybe that performance edge would be worth getting a stimulant. Some neuropsychologists in the Journal of the Clinical Neuropsychologists have estimated that about 1 in 4 adults who come to see them for ADHD medications are faking an ADHD diagnosis in order to get stimulants, either to use for themselves or to sell. And of course, well, another whole topic is diversion, the borrowing or stealing or selling of ADHD meds by people without ADHD, which has huge addiction potential. So this, in some ways, these 3 quick ads define sort of the terrain and the controversy about the topic. This isn't an assessment workshop that would take all day. There's 9 DSM symptoms of inattention and disorganization, 9 of hyperactivity and impulsivity. You have to have most of those. They've got to be impairing. They've got to appear in at least 2 or more situations. They have to have been present since before the age of 12, which we'll talk about again in a minute. And assessment is not ideally done the way it's done for most kids and adults in the US, which is about 12 to 15 minutes in a pediatrician's office for a kid, or 12 to 15 minutes in a GP's office if you're an adult. Without a thorough developmental history, without ruling out of trauma, without normed rating scales from informants, and if you're old enough, from self-reports, without testing in some cases, there's false positives and false negatives. The US, in another talk I could give but don't have time to today, and Israel have double the world's average of ADHD diagnostic prevalence. Unbelievably enough, around the world, except in subsistence cultures that don't have compulsory education, the prevalence of ADHD in people under 18 is 5.5%, almost invariantly. But the US is over 11%, Israel's about the same. And high performance cultures, done some writing and thinking about this, may play a role in inflating diagnoses in certain societies. But why have girls and women been so long ignored? So Letterman is over, but we're going to do a top 10 list all the same. So at Berkeley, our retired colleague, Irv Zucker, and his colleague in integrative biology, Annalise Beery, wrote a review over 10 years ago that's been replicated. We're not even talking about ADHD or clinical research or human research, but in basic animal physiology research. 30% of studies include the male of the species only, 8% the female only, and the remaining, let's do the math, 62% include both sexes, but hardly ever with analysis of interaction terms, because the female animal has these mysterious things like childbirth and cycles, and the females of the species are deemed too erratic to be the subject of basic psychophysiological studies. In 1993, 30 years ago, the NIH said, boy, this bias applies to clinical research and all of the NIH institutes. You better have a good reason not to include representatives of the female gender, if you will, and the male gender in your research. As of the last reviews of that almost 30-year-old legislation, it hasn't rectified the situation totally. Everybody knew that ADHD was a guy thing. I learned that in grad school. Most medical people learned it in their medical school training and residencies. And so if it's going to be something else other than ADHD in a girl and you don't diagnose it, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And in fact, ADHD goes along with a whole lot of other stuff at the same time. And if it's a girl, anxiety is highly likely. There can be conduct problems, learning problems. And so because of the lore and the bias, those diagnoses rose to the fore because we just know girls don't really get or have ADHD. Going quickly through these, as you can tell. What did ADHD used to be called before DSM-3? Hyperkinetic syndrome, hyperactivity, before that minimal brain dysfunction, before that a bunch of other things. The very name of which implied that it was little boys running around classrooms when they're not supposed to be, wreaking havoc. Then in DSM-3, ADD with or without hyperactivity. And just to make things utterly confusing, DSM-3R and DSM-4 and 5 have this term called ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but you might not have hyperactivity. You might have the inattentive form of that. I couldn't think of any more confusing language if I tried. How did you get a kid, number 6, in a hyperkinesis or ADHD study for decades? They had to pass criteria of hyperkinesis or ADHD on the Connors brief 10-item form. So Keith Connors, our former collaborator at the MTA, passed away a few years ago, had lengthy parent and teacher rating scales, all sorts of factors, and chose the 10 items from those scales that A, had the highest factor loadings on the basic single factor, and B, showed the greatest medication response in stimulant placebo trials. And those 10 items comprised the hyperkinesis index. 8 of the 10 items on the HI were acts as if driven by a motor, restless in the squirmy sense, restless always. 8 hyperactivity items and 2 inattention items. So the very diagnostic criteria used to get kids in the definitive studies of what ADHD is were completely biased toward males. Number 5, okay, put your head around this for a minute, and really interesting research. Let's go to a classroom. It doesn't really matter if there's kids with ADHD or not, and send objective observers in. So they're counting micro behaviors. The observers usually find that the boys have objectively more hyperactive impulsive symptoms than the girls, but girls and boys are pretty equal on inattention symptoms. But if the teachers, the very teachers teaching the same classrooms, when they're asked to provide end of month or end of semester ratings, they rate the boys as higher on both dimensions. And what's the cardinal tool for getting an ADHD diagnosis for a kid? A teacher rating. So teachers, through their own biases, are perceiving on the basis of factually greater hyperactive impulsive symptoms, more inattention in boys, again, biasing the whole diagnostic process. We're going to get through this list sooner or later. Number 4, for time immemorial, you couldn't have hyperkinesis or ADHD unless you had symptoms before the age of 7, basically first grade or before. And then in DSM-3, APA in its wisdom said, well, that's a little stringent. It's got to be before the age of 12, because what about more predominantly inattentive people, et cetera? It turns out that there are a bucket load of girls who, next slide or two, through coping and compensation and a bunch of strategies, have ADHD if you look closely, but it doesn't really reach clinical levels until middle school, high school, or well beyond. So these are the compensatory behaviors on the parts of girls and oftentimes their families. Coping, girls are supposed to do well academically. They overstudy. Perfectionism and anxiety rise, and the vicious cycle of, well, it's not ADHD because the anxiety and the perfectionism are salient, and they're really not above clinical threshold. And then middle school can be Waterloo, or high school, or post-secondary education, or work, or intimate relationships, when the full florid picture comes to the fore. What happens to girls as they become women? Puberty. A year earlier on average in girls than boys, ever earlier for the last 150 years. Childbirth, parturition, perimenopause, menopause, things that men don't get. Each of those, in a totally understudied way, have major impact on attentional regulation, executive functions, and impulse control. So there's a whole cascade of things across the lifespan that may be very influential about ADHD-related symptoms that we just don't know much about. And just to round out for the top 10, number 1, we won't really talk about much. Maybe as a result, we should rate girls and diagnose them with ADHD compared to other girls only, rather than both genders, because then we'd be missing too many. I'm not sure this is the case. I'm not sure that we should be comparing eating symptoms in boys, which are rarer than in girls, to only boys, or depression. If we just diagnose men with depression on the basis of comparison with other males, then we'd have equal sex ratios. I'm not sure that's what is in nature, but it raises an interesting question of what the norms that one uses would be to make the diagnosis. So I'm an ardent student of developmental psychopathology, multiple levels of analysis, from the molecules to the individual, to the dyad, to the school, to the community, to national policy. Something called heterotypic versus homotypic continuity. Do tantrums in a young kid predict later tantrums? Not so much, but early high levels of tantrums may predict a cascade of other externalizing behaviors that are phenotypically quite different from the initial symptom. So think of heterotypic continuity as we go through some of the subsequent slides. Multifinality, multiple roads can emerge from an initial risk factor. Equifinality, multiple roads lead to Rome. Many causal factors, different causal factors can eventuate in something like ADHD. All of these are important concepts to get out of the yes/no DSM diagnoses. People have posed for some decades now something called the gender paradox. The gender, or biological sex, and there's controversy over which term to use, with the lower prevalence has to have a more severe form of the condition in order to get diagnosed, kind of obviously. And maybe there's some underlying mechanisms for that. Under the polygenetic multiple threshold model, if that's the case, then for a girl to have ADHD, she's got to have more genetic vulnerability or a bigger family history or extra early environmental risk factors. In a different model, the constitutional variability model, so we can look at the two sexes, and boys naturally, using that word cautiously, have slower brain maturation, are less empathic in preschool, less verbal, less compliant. So we're going to expect more of syndromes related to those issues as they develop. But if a girl has clinically significant problems, she's going to be closer to having, quote, a real neural deficit or defect. I hate to use non-neurodivergent terminology, because it's more natural for boys to have side effects of these, but for a girl to have it means that she's almost qualitatively different. Different kinds of predictions from these different models. We'll come back to this just a little bit. Certainly glad for discussion about it. In the real world, when you look at carefully diagnosed kids with ADHD these days, it's not what I learned in grad school. It's not 10 to 1 or 15 to 1 or 20 to 1. Those were clinical samples. That was referral bias. It's about 2.3 or 4 or 5 to 1 boy for every girl who meets diagnostic criteria. Autism, again, is 10 to 1 or more. The most recent reviews say it's about 3 to 1, maybe a little bit more than that for the most severe forms of autism spectrum disorder. Girls with ADHD, as a couple of key studies have shown, really have impairments socially and academically and in terms of executive function. So again, this long-standing bias needs to be looked at squarely in the face. The two big studies that have been done in the last 30 years with samples of larger than 100 girls with ADHD are the Mass General study and our own Berkeley Girls with ADHD Longitudinal study. In Biederman's studies over the years, mainly white, mainly middle class, 140 boys. A few years before, the girl study with 140 neurotypical boys, all 6 to 17. So they were kids or adolescents at baseline, followed up for 10 years, and a similar pattern for girls. Very psychiatric studies at their follow-up looking for what diagnoses persist or don't persist over time. The girls with ADHD compared to their neurotypical counterparts had every major psychiatric comorbidity significantly greater, just as the boys had. Compared to the boys, the girls were equally likely to have these comorbidities over time, but slower to develop conduct disorder or severe ODD. It might happen by adolescence, but it wasn't as early onset as the boys. So back in 1993 and 4, I got a little bold and wrote a grant to the National Institutes of Mental Health saying, we really ought to learn more about girls with ADHD, and the pink sheets, as they were known as in the days, came back over fax machine and said, well, you haven't really built a good case for that. So persistence pays off with grant writing, as we know, resubmitted. And back in those days, you'd also get your priority scores via fax. And that grant had a 0.1 percentile. It was a top rated grant by NIMH that year. So we thought, wow, that's great. How are we going to get a sample of girls? How are we going to do this? So we recruited like mad throughout the Bay Area, pediatricians, school districts. We even put ads in the paper and went through a multi-gated procedure of about 10 hours duration to make sure that the initial criteria were, the bar was low enough that potentially girls with ADHD could get in, but they had to meet full sex neutral diagnostic interview thresholds. Over time, we've been successful in getting repeated funding every 5 or 5.5 years to follow the sample up. They participated in 6-week summer camp programs, girls with ADHD and neurotypical side by side, which enables you to learn a lot about peer relationships. You can pull kids for testing and all sorts of variables beyond traditional diagnosis. And over the years, thanks to the fact that we provided a good free program for them that was enriching, and we'd write reports and advocate, and we had budgets to fly to participants who'd moved from California or fly them back in. We had 92 to 93 to 95% retention. We're in the middle, we're almost ending our 5th wave, which started during the pandemic. We will curse that at another time, all online without NIMH funding, which after 22 years was cut. With some smaller foundation support, and we're hovering around 80% retention. A couple of girls are deceased from suicide. They happen to have had ADHD combined type early on. The numbers are very small, but not surprisingly, and they're all in their 30s at this point. What do you do in longitudinal research? If you want to measure change, don't change the measure, because then you've got apples and oranges. So the same ADHD symptom items on scales repeated wave after wave after wave, the same executive function measures, et cetera, et cetera. But if you only use those same measures and don't prune the way a neural system should, a longitudinal battery should prune, so you can add developmentally relevant variables. And one of the things we started to do at our 3rd wave, if you remember a couple slides ago, the young women at that age, at that time, are around 20, ranging between about 18 and 23. So we added measures of self-harm, A, suicidal intent, plan, or attempted suicide per se, or B, so-called non-suicidal self-injury. This mysterious and growing, epidemically growing phenomenon of doing serious and grievous damage to your body, but without the intention of dying, with the intention of relieving psychological pain through a physical manifestation, many theories as to why that might maintain itself. We're going to look at these as separate outcomes, but if you do your own mini meta-analysis, the best predictor of attempted suicide in one's 20s is a history of NSSI in one's teens. So don't think that they're totally separate. In our sample, it's correlation of about 0.5 at each wave. So when we published this paper, Hinshaw, Zalecki et al., 2012, in the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology, here's what we found. The girls who came into the summer camps with a diagnosis of ADHD combined, that's the red bar, both a lot of inattention and disorganization and a lot of hyperactivity and impulsivity. 23% had made an active suicide attempt by the mean age of 20. 8% of the inattentive and 6% of our neurotypicals. 6%, is that a Bay Area phenomenon? That's the national average in 2012. In terms of NSSI, that is way beyond cuticle picking or hair twirling, cutting, burning, banging yourself to leave bruise marks, moderate to severe, 51% of the girls originally diagnosed with the combined presentation of ADHD were engaging in moderate to severe, over a quarter of the inattentive and 19% of our neurotypical comparisons. 19%, that was the national average then, and it is now. What do the most recent data from CDC show? What's the average age of onset now in the United States for a girl who shows significant NSSI? 11.5. with a big bump in the curve below 10. So you think of a 7 or 8-year-old girl seriously injuring herself, it's becoming par for the course, tragically. And the Surgeon General calls this kind of a crisis of faith, and everybody's put out a big call with the mental health crisis in teens and young adults, especially around self-harm and suicide. So these are provocative findings. We got a lot of attention for it, even though our sample size is relatively small. But the question is, what are the mechanisms? So I'm going to show you a couple of mediation slides. Formal mediation is when you have at least 3-wave data, you've got predictor variables, you've got an outcome, but there's measurements in between temporally that might statistically explain the direct association between the predictor and the outcome. So in Erica Swanson's dissertation, now published a few years ago in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, the predictor over on the left is either ADHD yes/no diagnosis, or the presentation, or the number of sentences. Doesn't matter. The results come out the same. And the outcome over on the right is the severity of non-suicidal self-injury at our 3rd wave. And then at our 2nd wave, when the girls were about 14 and a half years on average, late middle school, early high school, we had a number of measures. The two, we didn't have hypothesis on this, so we looked empirically. The two mediator variables explain significant variation in the outcome were on the good old cancel underline test, a classic neuropsych test of response inhibition, and on parent and teacher reports during middle school or early high school of her acting out, her externalizing symptoms. Those are the explanatory factors for her NSSI. So, good working memory test for you all. Here's the same slide, but not quite. The outcome now is attempted suicide, binary at wave 3. The only significant partial mediator explaining that early ADHD to suicide attempt outcome 10 years later was the girls and the parents and the teachers composite of her internalizing depression, anxiety, social isolation symptoms. Response disinhibition, externalizing preferentially predicting NSSI, internalizing preferentially predicting mediating attempted suicide. Jocelyn Mesa, a grad student in the lab around that time, who's now a professor at UCLA, did the same thing, but she was very interested in peer contact and peer relationships. So the predictor here is commission errors. It could be ADHD symptoms. It could be ADHD diagnosis. Don't worry about the box on the left. Again, first predicting the severity of NSSI. The only significant mediator was the girls' report in middle school or early high school of how much and how severely her friends, her peers, physically or relationally bullied her. In contrast, the only significant mediator of attempted suicide was the teacher's report on a validated scale of what percentage of that girl's classmates actively rejected her and excluded her. Self-perception of being victimized, preferentially related to NSSI. Teacher's report of actual social exclusion, if you think about it, it's somewhat intuitive, predicting actual attempted suicide. In a major finding, Maya Gundelman is a neuropsychologist in the area, was a grad student around that time too, did a blinded review of all of our 140 girls with ADHDs and all of our 88 neurotypical comparisons charts. Took a year and a half to do, to find objective evidence of physical abuse, sexual abuse, and or neglect. So we combined those together because we got more power to do it that way. The long story short is we know that in our sample and other samples, girls with ADHD experience more of these forms of maltreatment than do neurotypical girls. But within the ADHD sample, and these subgroups are pretty much matched on every baseline variable, if you had ADHD in girlhood through our extensive assessments, but had no experience documented of this maltreatment, 1 in 7 had made a serious suicide attempt by the age of 20. But if you had early ADHD and had received either physical or sexual abuse or neglect or some combination, that went up to 34%. So this is the first instance we know of in the literature where something as heritable as ADHD, 75 to 80%, if accompanied by early trauma and maltreatment, the risk for suicide, relative risk, is about 2.35. And this is very consonant with studies of bipolar disorder with veterans, thousands of people in samples, which has a heritability of even more than ADHD, 85% or so. The experience of early physical or sexual abuse raises the already astronomical suicide risk for people with bipolar disorder by 50%. It's not genes and brains solely, it's not context and environment solely, it's the combination that predicts the worst outcomes. We also found in another study by Maya that the girls with ADHD had 3 times the rate of sexual assault or intimate partner violence. So there's a pathway, if you're thinking heterotypic continuity, something about early not fitting in with the crowd and poor executive functions and over talking and achievement isn't what it should be, that in girls in particular is leading to an internalizing, pretty self-destructive path. And if we had more time, we'd talk about, well, if you're traumatized when you're young, that predicts outcomes. You can't also have ADHD, and why would you treat a traumatized kid with medication? Or could it be both? Some of the very same risk factors for trauma are the very same risk factors for ADHD, which if we had a workshop, it would be fun with the whole CTRP team to really talk about this. Another factoid, this is a study that Liz Owens led for our 4th wave. The average age is about 26 or 7 of the young by then. Our neurotypicals, 10.5% had experienced 1 or more unplanned pregnancies and 43.5% for the ADHD. We didn't really need a significance test. It's a huge difference. The important, in another study that Liz published with me, the mediator of that, I don't have a slide for it, was poor academic achievement in middle school and high school. So academic disidentification seems to be playing a role in the vulnerability to unplanned pregnancy in your teens or 20s. Many other things, don't have time to talk about, including Liz's 2016 paper, which is one of the 10 best papers in developmental psychopathology, no thanks to me, in the last century. So what's summarized? In our sample and in others, girls with ADHD are at risk for externalizing delinquent style outcomes, but not nearly to the same extent as boys. Our girls with ADHD graduated from high school at non-significantly lower rates than the girls, the neurotypical girls. But the parents would say, because we picked her up and carried her, put her on our back. And then after high school, multiple jobs, firings, multiple community colleges, that's when the ADHD problems really mount in terms of both higher education and vocational status. And of course, as I've just been talking about, these rates of self-harm are astronomical and tragic. The first decade of life, let's go very general, because when you're in utero and you have an XY configuration, what does that little puny Y chromosome with all 46 of its genes tell your body to do? Secrete testosterone and other androgens, which makes you, quote, a guy physiologically, and it also slows your brain development. Boys are less empathic, less compliant, less verbal in the first few years of life. We eventually catch up, I think, I hope. So it's little wonder that there's more boys than girls with autism, sort of a social deficit, if you want to call it that condition, or a self-regulatory condition like ADHD, or Tourette's, or many forms of learning disability. The second decade of life, as I've written about in other venues, is now with early puberty and the attendant pressures that girls have, which has really gone to the nth degree in the last 5 years since the pandemic. This is the age of rapid onset of depression, anxiety, binge eating, self-harm in girls. Just a slide on treatment response. There's only been one good meta-analysis in the last 5 years that looked at the world's literature on behavioral psychosocial interventions and on medication interventions for girls versus boys or men versus women with ADHD. This is not a huge effect, but it's clearly significant, maybe clinically significant. Girls and women are more likely than boys and men to have adverse responses to stimulants. And with the non-stimulants, the antihypertensives or the SNRIs, the Strateras of the world, are more likely than boys to show a preferential response. So for the pediatricians out there, child and adolescent, young adult psychiatrists, non-stimulants might be a viable alternative to stimulants, especially if it's a female patient in front of you. So we're going to wrap up with a few words on stigma, something I've become quite involved with at a theoretical and empirical level over the last 25 years. Stigma is a term deriving, it's interesting, it appears in ancient Greek language and ancient Latin language, meaning the brands, the burns on your skin, or the metal rods that were heated to make those brands. You're marked. I'm in the Agora, ancient Athens, shopping. How do I know that my fellow shoppers here might have actually fought for Sparta or been former slaves? Well, I wouldn't, except they're stigmatized on their shoulder, underneath the toga and peering out. So now I know. Most stigma today is psychological or inferred rather than a physical brand, except if you were in a concentration camp in Germany or Poland in the 30s or 40s when you were tattooed or branded with numbers on your left wrist. Or in a number of countries on Earth in the 80s, the most stigmatized disease on the planet at that point, HIV/AIDS, you were literally branded. So everyone knew to keep away. But most stigma today isn't a physical mark, it's a psychological one. A lot of interest in prejudice, starting with Gordon Alpert's work in the 50s, and then Goffman's 1963 book, Stigma, Notes on the Development of a Spoiled Identity, in prejudice and stigma as applied to mental and neurodevelopmental disorders, a big growing literature. And in the middle of the slide, there's a number of groups who receive stigma, in-group, out-group, basic social psychology, and I included here left-handedness. Why would that be up there? Well, back in Columbus, Ohio, our maternal grandmother didn't want my little sister Sally to be left-handed. It was, remember, left, sinister from Latin. Left is bad. But today, if you're left-handed, you're one of the 11%, you probably have a good chance of having good spatial abilities, might get into MIT. It's almost revered. So it's a trivial example, or is it? As social norms and mores change, formerly stigmatized attributes may not be. But what are the bottom three in the United States today? What are the most stigmatized attributes you can have? Do you have a mental illness? Do you have a house? Are you unhoused, homeless? And or do you use substances? Are you addicted? The lowest of the low, as Susan Fiske put it in her sort of 2x2 classification of who receives stigma. Stigma is a hot topic in evolutionary psychology. Maybe we're all wired and naturally selected to stay away from contagious people, or people who might be cheating us, or people whose behaviors and looks are very different from us. And at a social psychological level, there are stereotypes. We have to all engage in stereotypes or in a big group, which become laden with affect, becomes prejudice, prejudgment, and then inevitably discrimination. And I'm a very progressive Berkeley professor. I've never engaged in any of those except against Stanford, which is our rival school, because they wear red, not blue, and they're private and they're elite. Now, those are true. The three things I said are true. But you hear my tone of voice, and no Stanford student will ever audit my class. So I'm going to discriminate. Again, a trivial example, but what does discrimination mean for highly stigmatized groups over time? Exclusion in the so-called Middle Ages. People with mental illnesses were banished from cities and towns and forced to live in the countryside like animals. A concentration camps, extermination. Stigma is the sum total of stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, with two important corollaries. A, you lose your individuality because you're no more than like every other member of that group. And then second, you're vermin, as Hitler called not only Jewish people, not only Roma, but gay and lesbian people and people with so-called feeble-mindedness, intellectual disabilities and mental illnesses who ended up in the camps exterminated. So the stakes are high with stigma. Wrote a book on this in 2007. It really needs an update. I'm looking for volunteers to re-author the second edition. Don't raise your hands now. I chose for the cover art the middle of a triptych by Hieronymus Bosch, the phantasmagoric Dutch Flemish painter. This is in 1496, hanging in the Prado. It's called The Extraction of the Stone of Madness. So in the middle of this triptych the surgeon, but the surgeon's wearing a wizard hat. So Bosch is toying with this already. Is trephining, cutting a hole into the gentleman skull to remove the stone. The cause of mental illness was thought in Northern Europe to be a stone in the head for centuries. The priest with the chalice is giving a blessing. The patient, non-anesthetized, is beseeching us what is going on. But if you've got good eyes, what is the surgeon really removing from the patient's head? You don't see a stone coming out, you see kind of two V tufty shaped things. Bosch, in interviews about this painting at the time that have been preserved, said, I was painting the surgeon's removal of a flower. What was the name for mental illness in Holland in 1496? You were called a tulip head. Tulips are a big source of commerce then. They still are now in the Netherlands. So Bosch, 527 years ago, was eerily modern. If you remove the tulipness, the flower, the label, is that liberating? Or does the tulipness, does the diagnosis get you treatment? And how effective is the treatment? So that's why I chose the cover art. If you're a member of a group that receives stigma, it's likely, but not inevitable, that you'll internalize it. You'll engage in self-stigma. There are scales. Jennifer Boyd up at the VA and Livingston in 2010 developed the ISME, the Internalized Stigma of Mental Illness Scale, which is a specific measure, not of general anxiety or depression or internalizing symptoms, but your belief in the low valuation of yourself because of the group you're in, which mainly focuses on mental illness. High levels of self-stigma, adjusting statistically for anxiety and depression, more non-specific factors, predicts two things: never getting engaged in treatment or dropping out early. And of course, there's structural issues. Do we have a health insurance program in this country? Is there equitable access? No. But self-stigma perpetuates a vicious cycle of non-engagement in treatment. And then Goffman, in his 1963 book, read it. You can get it on Amazon for 75 cents. It's a little paperback now. At one point said in chapter 4, I think, if society bothers to stigmatize you or your group, it's only common courtesy for society to stigmatize anyone associated with you. That's just courteous. Like your family. And in the case of mental and neurodevelopmental disorders, it was really a double whammy. What did we all know was the cause of autism for most of the 20th century? Refrigerator parents. Parents so cold and aloof that their kids couldn't even have an attachment bond with them. The cause of schizophrenia was having a schizophrenic mother, hostile, cold, aloof, demanding you had to create your own alternative reality to survive that. Parenting matters a lot, even for heritable conditions, but the parents as the culprits, we've thrown that largely out because of behavioral and molecular genetic work and because of developmental psychopathology. Who else is in the penumbra of courtesy stigma? I'm a clinical psychologist. A lot of you are trainees or psychiatrists or doctors of some kind. We work with crazy people. We work with kids who don't learn very well. We don't have the prestige of being a neurosurgeon where you can actually change the brain, or an oncologist or a cardiologist. If you ask the way that Otto Wall did some years ago, people, adults with histories of schizophrenia or severe depression or bipolar disorder, qualitative interviews and quantitative scales to follow up, from whom have you received the most stigma in your life? In the top 3 are the interactions I've had with my treating professional. I never thought I'd go to college or finish or hold a job or have a relationship, all the way to the horrible term Gomer, not used so much anymore, get out of my emergency room. We treat people with real wounds and illnesses, not people who use drugs or hear voices. So the stigma perpetrated by our very professions is not a thing of the past. Structural stigma, Mark Hatzenbuehler, our colleague at Harvard, in 2016 wrote a piece in American Psychologist saying, stigma isn't just public, it's not just personal, it exists in laws and policies, and has shown through incredible triple difference longitudinal analyses that if you're a sexually minoritized youth and you live in a state without hate crime legislation or that doesn't provide protection to individuals, you're about twice or three times as likely to have anxiety or depression. And in his most recent work, getting data from clinicians and clinical trials, in those states, you respond about half as well to evidence-based treatments as people living in other states. So it's a structural level too. So I know about a lot of this firsthand. The book that Anne so nicely mentioned that I wrote a few years ago, Another Kind of Madness, portrays on the cover my dad, the philosopher Virgil Hinshaw Jr., and me when I was 18, my first summer break from college back east. We're in the backyard of our home in Columbus, Ohio. And just 2 months before, Dad had called me into his home study to tell me about things he'd been forbidden to talk about by his own lead doctor at Ohio State. He'd had a diagnosis of schizophrenia since he was 16, jumped off the roof of his family home to save the world from the fascists. It's clearly a fast rising episode of mania that wasn't really diagnosed in the United States for many decades. And told me that the reason he was absent for 3 months, 6 months, or a year at a time when I was little, his doctor told his wife, my mom, and him, if your children ever learn of your mental illness or hospitalizations, which happen to be at some of the country's worst snake pit hospitals, they'll be permanently destroyed. You are never allowed to raise the topic. So in a passage in this book where I kind of deflect from the narrative for a moment, what would we say today to the oncologist who said, your cancer is so toxic, if your children ever learn about it, they'll be permanently destroyed? Well, we sue the doctor for malpractice. Everybody knows the whole family has to rally around. But in the 50s and 60s, I mean, this is not in the Middle Ages, but in the middle of the last century, mental illness was deemed so toxic that it couldn't be discussed as a family. So what did I do as a kid? Well, I had sports, thank God, in Columbus, Ohio, did pretty well in school, and I blamed myself. I must have been the reason Dad left, because I didn't know if he was alive or dead when he got be gone for 6 months or a year at a time. My mom said, your dad is resting in another state. We'll hear from him someday, maybe. That's all she was allowed to say. So one of the legacies beyond genetics, intergenerational transmission, is if it's shame and silence, kids have really two choices when really crummy stuff's happening in a family and no one talks about it. A, believe the world's a random, cruel place, not a very healthy attribution. Or B, you probably caused it. Now, it's not true, but at least it gives the illusion of some personal control. So over the years, right after that talk with Dad, 2 months before this photo, back at spring break, I changed my major to psychology and thought maybe I can help diagnose that, or maybe I can work with lonely kids, or maybe do something to help the world understand mental illness and neurodevelopmental disorders. In our country, we know from repeated surveys where the measures have been the same for 60 years, American public knows far more about mental illness and neurodevelopment than in the 50s, and levels of stigma have not budged. And in fact, 3 times more people today, if they hear the term mental illness, think automatically of aggression, violence, than in 1955. The exception, the ray of light, appeared just a year and a half ago from Bernice Pesco-Solido, our sociologist colleague at Indiana University, who directs the National Stigma Survey. For the first time between 2009 and 19, social distance, the desire to stay away from people with depression, went down with an effect size of 0.4. But in the same survey, social distance towards schizophrenia and addiction went up by a delta of 0.3. So it's a mixed blessing. Maybe athletes and celebrities, and the change was driven in the survey by people under 30. It's young people who are starting to kind of heed the call to destigmatize, but it's uneven. And addiction, believed to be highly controllable, schizophrenia, psychosis, and threat are not following the same trajectory, at least yet, as depression. Why would ADHD receive stigma? To come full circle, it's not as severe as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, PTSD. Well, it certainly can be, particularly for girls and women, as I took some pains to say. And what is, sort of a quiz for you, people study executive functions, cognitive control, working memory, response inhibition, planning, all these tests you give kids or adults with ADHD. Which of those domains has the biggest effect size to separate people with ADHD from neurotypical people? Trick question. None of the above or all of the above. In any test you give, what separates groups is the variability across a person's trial. People with ADHD are far more inconsistent than neurotypicals. Consistent inconsistency, ADHD is misnamed. It's not an attention deficit disorder. People with ADHD hyperfocus. It's a deficit in the ability to regulate attention as situations and demands shift. So if you're consistently inconsistent, people make the attribution. She could control it in algebra, why not in history? Gee, you were great in soccer practice, but in the game, that clover was very salient and the winning goal was by your ear. And if you're a girl in particular, where you're supposed to achieve well, what percentage of college students in the United States are women today? 61%, very different from when I was in college. And you're supposed to be sociable and not interrupt and overtalk. ADHD in females probably receives a double, if not triple whammy, certainly with intersectionality if you're in a minoritized group, making ADHD stigma surprisingly high. So a couple summary slides. If I haven't convinced you, stick around, I'll talk to you for the rest of the day. ADHD does exist in girls and women. We have to assess it carefully. Hyperverbality, inconsistency may be much more salient in girls than hyperactivity per se. There may be masking and compensation. You got to look very carefully when you assess. Heterotypic continuity. Females with ADHD tend to, certainly not all, but way too many go on a path towards self-harm and sexual issues, both being victimized and not using judgment, et cetera, or planning in terms of pregnancy protection. If I had to emphasize anything today, when you're assessing an individual with ADHD, look for strengths, not just weaknesses. Those are the rewards for your reward program, and that may be the somewhat atypical trajectory that the person traverses over time. And treatments for girls, groups, and working on executive functions may be particularly important. So thanks to funders, thanks to UCSF, I'm so glad to, for the last 10 years, have been able to be a faculty both at Cal and here in our department at UCSF. And what I'm going to do, we got time for a couple of questions, is disrobe slightly to show you the t-shirt I'm going to wear for the Disability Awareness Campaign. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you. So
just anybody with a question or two, call it out.
Actually, Steve.
And do you want to moderate it? Yeah.
Yeah. And also, so if you have a question and if you really want to ask it, raise your hand. Meanwhile, one comment is that in your book, The Mark of Shame, I remember that the most surprising thing I learned was that the stigmatization of mental illness was practically the same in mental health circles. So it's not just that we're stigmatized.
It's not just in the general
And so
public. Yeah.
Related to that, couldn't we look at what is happening even in our own backyard regarding the sort of carving off of ADHD as something that does not, in a sense, does not belong in the consciousness of adult psychiatry, and what's the relationship of that to stigma? So if not us, who? And if not now, when?
And we might, all of us, especially those trained in the dark ages like myself, might have to overcome some of our training. And we hope that the training models are better and more humane. So if you're in Zoom land, my t-shirt says the future is stigma free. So that'll be the subject of some photographs from Susan coming up. Come on, somebody's got a question.
Go ahead.
I do here.
Please.
Great shirt. And thank you for the wonderful talk. In your longitudinal study, were the participants treated, or this was purely observational?
This was a naturalistic study. It wasn't a clinical trial. I was part of the multimodal treatment study of kids with ADHD, where we randomly assigned 600 kids around the country, 80% boys, 20% girls, to medication, behavior therapy, combination, or treatment as usual. Many of the girls back in the 90s had some exposure to stimulants, but with the usual lack of care and precision that a lot of pediatricians, they're just not trained to do it. Some had behavioral family therapy, some had counseling. And so in every analysis, we adjust statistically for the treatment histories they had. What's the problem with assessing that? If you do, how does chemotherapy look in a naturalistic study? It predicts worsening and death because the most severe cancer patients get chemotherapy. So we never know if we adjust for treatment. Did treatment pluck out the girls who needed it most, or the girls with families that were most aware with health insurance? So you need a trial to really gain any traction on causal pathways. Yes, please.
Hi, I have a question. I'm a psychiatry resident and learning to diagnose and treat ADHD, and I have a lot of women seeking treatment for
Okay,
ADHD.
speak right into the mic because you're cutting out every other word.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I have a lot of women that come to see me to get an ADHD diagnosis and treatment. And I wonder, many of these women have had neuropsych testing, like in their teens, that did not show any signs of ADHD. And then I'm sitting there like, now they're 20, right, and we have that evidence. And then the parents are like, we've never seen any ADHD symptoms in this child or in our child. I just wonder if you have a comment on kind of gender bias in neuropsych testing. And I mean, I guess that's my main question. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. I'll take the next half hour to address that. So ADHD is known commonly as an executive function disorder, but so is depression, and so is schizophrenia. And so, I mean, it's not very specific. And when you do objective neuropsych testing, about 30 to 40% of people with otherwise bona fide ADHD pass the test fine. It's one-on-one with a practitioner in an enclosed room. But try to do those same skills in a classroom, on a playground, it's much harder. The more ecologically valid measures, the brief, the little rating scale that measures executive functions in the real world, has a higher sensitivity, but then you're not sure if you're measuring ADHD symptoms or underlying executive functions. The rule of thumb, and Liz and others could talk to you about this at length too, is you can give the world's most detailed executive function battery, might help you identify strengths and weaknesses, but ADHD is a behavioral diagnosis. It's pretty low tech. Brain scanning, yeah, there's group differences and brain regions and pathways, but the positive and negative predictive power are still very poor. We don't have the definitive neuropsych test or brain scan to make we don't have biomarkers in psychiatry the way we do in other fields. So it's a huge issue. And I see we're at time. There's a question way back here. The best interventions for kids up through the teen years are to remove or reduce symptoms, the medications. Stimulants give you the best effect size. The non-stimulants aren't as strong, but they're way above placebo. Those benefits stop the day you stop taking the medication. There's no generalization. To enhance behavioral performance in academics, reward-based behavioral treatments, or if you're a teen, CBT, cognitive behavioral treatments, organizational skills, anger management are clearly evidence-based. Many fewer studies than medications. And if you look across all the clinical trials ever done, by far the biggest effect sizes occur for people who have the combination of the right dosage of medication and behavioral or cognitive behavioral treatments. So we could talk about neurofeedback, we could talk about diet, we could talk about aerobic exercise. Some are promising, some aren't, but let the buyer beware, because you go to the autism websites and the ADHD websites, and if you know much, you get depressed really quickly on everything that's touted that is snake oil.
So actually, I'm gonna ask people to come talk to Steve if you have more questions, because we are way past
We're past our time, so
Yes.
come on up. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.